Welcome to ATD Suncoast and our April Learning event. Our subject tonight is Let's Talk About Inclusion. Before we start, I'd like to thank our sponsors for their generous and continued support. The panel tonight is moderated by Cassandra Massessa of Raymond James Financial. Our panelists include Melinda Washington, Community Engagement Manager of the James Museum of Western and Wildlife Art, Kaylee Mish, IT Training and Project Specialist at Tech Data, Pedro Surreal, Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Raymond James Financial, and Robbie Price, Member of Contact Learning at USAA. The first question to our panel was, how have industry trends and opportunities shifted in the D&I space, and what has been the most interesting thing you've observed? So, let's join the conversation.
Understand the business case. You don't have to have that conversation around the business case. The questions that I get on a day-to-day basis is, what do we need to do and how do we need to do it? And the last thing that I would say that the biggest shift that I've seen in my space is that this is about behavioral change. So taking D&I and putting the lens, looking at it with a change management lens, it's an important component to it. And I've seen that those organizations, or those of us who embrace it from a change management perspective, really help organizations along this journey, because it's about understanding where we are and where do we need to go and how do we come alongside the businesses to achieve our business goals. So for me, it's just that connection between social justice and driving business outcomes.
That's great. Yeah, I agree with all of that. We're heading in a good direction. This diversity and inclusion is going to continue to grow and constantly see allyship and events getting bigger. It just shows the need and the want from the public that they want to start including people more. So the next question is about gender pronouns. This was actually included because Mel took a poll on Facebook and she asked her sphere of influence, what are some things that they would like to understand more? And most everybody really wants to know about the binary pronouns. So Merriam-Webster's word of the year is they, and the slide shows you some of the definitions and examples. So, feel free to take a screenshot of that. Increasingly, companies are adopting the use of gender pronouns in their email signatures, software platforms for their clients, employee directories. Can you share with us what your company may be doing, and what are your thoughts on gender pronouns? Kaylee?
Yeah, I love this question because this is something that my eyes were open to back in December when I went through the CDP training. Being in a room full of D&I practitioners was, first of all, a wonderful experience, and just getting all that feedback and these ideas. And one of the simple things that I heard many people saying was just put your pronouns in your email signature. And it's such a simple thing, and just had never even crossed my mind as a cisgendered person to say, I should clarify my pronouns. And then there was a classmate of ours in that group who was transgendered and uses they, them, theirs as their pronouns. And I was just like, yeah, this matters. Like, I want this person to feel valued the way I want to feel valued for who I am as an individual. So I think it's such an easy thing to do. Even if your organization as a whole is not doing it, you can go and add these things into your email signature. It will take 30 seconds of your time to make that change, but the impact that it can have on somebody who sees that while they're communicating with you is just massive. Think about, from a recruitment perspective, if a transgendered individual is coming to apply for a job and the first thing they see from the recruiting officer in HR at the company is those pronouns in the signature, that instantly sends the message of, this is a welcoming company, this is an inclusive environment, and you're welcome here. We don't care what you go by, just bring yourself here and be a talent and be part of our team. That's what we value, is what you can do, not what your gender is. And I think that it's just so important, and it's so easy to make that change. And even not from a transgender perspective, but there are a lot of people, especially in my organization, we work with global counterparts. We're a global organization, and there are plenty of people who I work with who have a name that is not familiar to me. And I don't know what this person's gender pronouns are, even just by their name. And I can think of an example. I was emailing someone recently back and forth, and their name, I just assumed it was a man. And only after many, many emails did somebody else say, oh yeah, she sent this in the email. And I realized, oh my gosh, I hope I didn't call this person he in an email chain somewhere. I'd be so embarrassed. And that's the kind of embarrassment we should be feeling for people who go by they. Like, why doesn't that carry, something to think about, why doesn't that carry forward for anybody's chosen pronoun? So it's just something so simple that you can do to make people feel welcomed and to make sure everybody is being treated with the respect that they deserve.
I love it. In my conversations prior to this, Robbie, you had a unique perspective on it. You want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, so I shared with you a story of a friend of mine that I grew up with in the community theater world, and being the unapologetic person that I am and not being afraid to really share anything about myself, I was always the gay friend. So growing up, people obviously had questions about a lot of things, and I just recently got a message on Facebook from a friend of mine that I hadn't talked to in probably 20 years. And she reached out to me, and I had this long, glowing message, basically boiled down to she now has a 15-year-old son who was born female and who's going through the transition. And she reached out and said, had it not been for me knowing you and me seeing that you were so comfortable in who you were, and really talked to me and let me ask questions and let me be inquisitive and didn't shoot me down for asking those questions. Had it not been for that, I wouldn't have been in the position that I am to accept my son for who they now are. And I read this, and I'm just a big emotional mess, and I cried. And I called a friend of mine and I let them read it, and we cried together. And then I called back the friend that had written the letter to me. And of course, then we cried and we laughed and we smiled. But it really touched me to know that that somebody now feels comfortable enough with their son and is proud of them and shows them off and talks about them openly to people and doesn't hide the fact that they have a young transgender son. And that really touched me in a way that very few things have. And like I said, I was just an emotional wreck, crying every day for a good week thinking about that story.
Thank you. Melinda or Pedro, do you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add to that it comes down to education and helping organization understand the importance of it. As Kaylee mentioned, and even as Rob mentioned in their stories, it came down to education. I know we're at some point we're talking about psychological safety. It's really allowing those who are seeking to understand what the importance of a pronoun is to the community, because it really comes down to identity and helping individuals. I think that's, I always get the question, well, why is that so important? Well, why should we do this? And so it starts with the educational component and really figuring out where the organization is or the readiness of the organization to introduce it. Because to me, it's very important how you introduce it into the organization versus just introducing it with a big splash. So education awareness is very important. And at the end of the day, it's stories like Robbie just shared that help allies understand the importance to the community. So we as practitioners have to be able to harness those stories and share them so that we can continue with the education and awareness.
Right. So we'll just move into psychological safety since, as you mentioned, even just the mere recognition of recognizing gender pronouns in as itself practicing psychological safety. So it's very important in diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and a fundamental component in fostering a learning environment. Would you share with us some techniques you use to nurture psychological safety to your employees? And I know, Pedro, you are a person who leads many conversations and meetings. Maybe you could also share some best practices on how you use the room and read the room to pull people back in when you see anybody that's kind of shutting down or closing themselves off. So we'll start with you if you don't mind.
Sure. So psychological safety is really just basically creating an environment where anyone or everyone feels safe in just sharing thoughts, asking questions without feeling retribution or that they may be humiliated. And the best way to do that is to start with self by creating a space of vulnerability. And again, storytelling is a very powerful way to break down walls. It's a very powerful way to let people in. One of the things that I practice when I'm reading a room is just making sure that I'm scanning the room and looking at body language. And so, in order to create psychological safety in those types of environments, you always, if someone brings something up, you take a look at the nonverbal cues, right? And you always want to make sure that you leave the person whole and that you leave them complete. If something comes up, you address it in the moment, and you make sure that whatever topic is being discussed, that you pause and that you acknowledge the individual, you acknowledge the situation, and ask permission to pivot and pick that conversation up at another point in time, right? The most important thing is to make sure that you leave that person complete. One of the things I'm always very cautious about, and whenever I'm either leading a topic of diversity or any inclusion discussion, is to make sure that no harm is done to an individual or the organization, making sure that where whatever topics that we have, that people are really allowing each other to share their thoughts and perspectives. One of my coaching backgrounds is in ontology, which is the state of being. And one of the things that we state is that we often see the world not as it is, as we are. And ontology is really the practice of understanding how body connects with emotion and language, right? So seek to understand how individuals are holding themselves, right, from a body position. Seek to understand the language that they're using to communicate, the tone. Seek to understand what types of emotions they may be experiencing, and that'll help you really create that space, that safe space. But to me, it comes down to showing your own personal vulnerability and inviting those individuals to engage in the conversation. But again, the most important thing is to leave people whole and make sure that they're complete before moving on to the next subject or the next topic.
Yeah, agreed. I definitely think the organization's psychological safety is determined by leadership, as Pedro mentioned, and the values and the mission of the organization itself. If a company is feeling, for example, the Jays Museum, we advocate candor. It's all about candor and transparency. So we want associates to feel as if they can speak up, express their concerns, and be heard. Now, I want to note that this is not to say the safe questions, or these are not to ask the safe questions. A true psychologically safe workplace, as Pedro mentioned, is one where people are not afraid to ask these hard questions. And on the contrary, they shouldn't be ridiculed or punished if they just don't understand. So that conversation of transparency and feeling empowered is a large part of psychological safety.
I think one thing that you can do also to build psychological safety, my facilitator style, I try to just be as human as possible in front of a room. You are still a facilitator. Still need to maintain that sense of authority in the room so that if things start to go off track, you can pull it back and people are giving you respect as the leader of the discussion. But I don't ever want to be, I've been in trainings that were great and I've been in trainings that were not good. And it comes down to the facilitator. And I tune in on it more because I have an education background and I do training in my career. But I don't want to ever be somebody who's like lecturing the room. I don't want to be stiff. I don't want to make people feel like they're input is not wanted. You're just here to listen, and then you're going to leave. That is absolutely the opposite of what should happen, because that's not real learning in the first place. If you feel like you can't even speak, you're not paying attention to what's going on around you. You're sitting there and thinking, what am I supposed to do in here? It's just really uncomfortable. So I try to be really human in all of my interactions. I'm a clumsy person by nature. So if I trip over the cord in the middle of my presentation, I'm going to call it out. Like, I'm human. I'm going to tell stories about myself and about times I've made mistakes or about something crazy that I did. I'll start off the conversation just by asking people about themselves, about their weekends, and just open that space and start small. You never, especially in something like a D&I conversation where you can get into real heavy topics pretty easily and heavy discussions, start small. The stories that you're sharing, keep them simple and go along further so that people feel like they're coming on that journey with you. It's not too much, too fast. I recently went through a training on how to train a D&I course that we're going to do for our leadership in the upcoming months. And one of the facilitators there told us, only take people apart as much as you can reasonably put them back together by the end of the course. And I really, really, really loved that, because D&I, there's so much to it, and you can unpack a lot. You can unpack a lot in a class. You can really go down a spiral and have people feel like they're leaving with this heavy weight that didn't get closed up correctly, that didn't get put, like Pedro said, make them complete. If they leave and they feel like they've just been broken and then they were left like that, that's not psychological safety. People don't want to come back and learn from you again. So open those conversations, get people to give you a little bit, but make sure that you're not going too far, that you can wrap it up and make them feel like, I got something out of this. I gave a little bit of myself and I feel better, not I feel worse.
Those are all great ideas. Robbie, do you have anything?
For myself, it kind of mirrors a lot of what Kaylee said, is telling your own personal stories and kind of sharing your own human journey, because I can't expect anyone else to share what they've gone through if I haven't laid myself bare the same way. As I mentioned, I'm a big crier. I love emotion. I think that emotion is important. It's part of what makes us human, and it is okay to bring emotion to work, as long as it's done in a constructive way. So, I don't want people to feel like you can't maybe have a moment where you get angry and then brush it off and move on, or you can't have a moment where you remember a story that brings you to tears and then you, again, brush it off and move on. You need to be able to bring that humanity to all facets of your life, and that includes work, because we're there 40 hours a week at a minimum for most of us, and that's a big chunk of time.
Yeah. Thank you. Those are all fantastic. I think for me personally, as a fitness trainer, I also have to pull in psychological safety, especially for new members who are conscious or subconscious about, maybe their weight and all that. So we address weight biases and abilities in the fitness center. So I think psychological safety can be applied in a very broad spectrum at all different levels in your departments. Let's go over the diversity groups, ERGs, BRGs, learning from each of you. You all have different acronyms for your infinity networks, as they used to be called. We'll go over this briefly. I think one of the most interesting conversations about this is my one-on-one with Kaylee. So you had mentioned that you would like to see mental health as a diversity group, and this is more of cognitive diversity. So I wanted you to go ahead and talk about that and your thoughts.
Yeah, so I shared at the beginning when I was sharing my story that I went through a personal journey with anxiety, and I don't think I'm ever going to stop being on that journey. I've made the choice to go and get the help that I need for it, and that's something that a lot of people even struggle to do. But one of the things that came out of that, and just in sharing my story, is that I've had friends reach out to me, similar to Robbie's story that he shared, and just said, because you shared this story and because you were real with your battle, I recognize now that I need to get some help with a mental health issue that I'm dealing with, and can you please offer me some advice or ask me somewhere to go? And it's interesting because some of these people that have come to me are some of the strongest people that I know, and it's not the people you would ever expect to say, I'm struggling and I don't feel like I have my life together, and I don't know what to do, and I need help. Mental health is a really taboo subject still in our society and our culture, and it's unfortunate because it should be taken more seriously. But it's not, and it's not covered by insurance the way physical health is. It's a difficult subject to navigate, but many people will experience mental health issues in their life, especially in the workplace, where the stress of your everyday life is just compounded. For me in the technology industry, it's a 24/7 industry. You're constantly working. You don't just do a 9 to 5. So it's hard to shut off some days, and that can really wear on you. So we have 5, we call them BRGs at Tech Data, business resource groups. We have 5 for the pretty typical affinity groups that you think of. We have a Black resource group, a women's resource group, an LGBT group, Hispanic Latinx, and a veterans group. But mental health is something that so many people deal with on all different levels, all different scales, and just being able to put out resources for your colleagues and say, it's okay if you need these. You can be anonymous. You don't have to come to big events and shout from the rooftops, I have depression. It's not anything like that. It's just something that's here for you, that we can support each other through these difficult times.
Great, thank you. So next we're going to talk about Deloitte's framework for inclusive leadership. They define it into 7 traits, signature traits. Sorry, there's actually 6. We asked them to pick a 7th one, so 7's on my mind. So we'll go around the table here and talk about what your favorite trait is, and if you had one that you would add to this. I would like to start this one off with Robbie.
So my favorite out of this is really courage, and this kind of goes back to what I was speaking to earlier, in that I like to lay myself out there for the people that I train, because it humanizes me, and I think that the more people see me as just another human being, the more trust they have in me. So I tell people about my successes, sure, because I want them to think of me as a leader, but I also want to tell them about the times that I failed. I want to tell them about the struggles that I've had, because I want people to realize that that's just a part of who you are, and it's part of your life's journey, and that it doesn't mean that you are less than somebody else, because ultimately we overcome our struggles. So I want people to know about those times, maybe when I applied for a job and didn't get it, and I was hurt by that, and it made me sad. But what I did was I took the feedback and I incorporated that into the next time that I applied for something. Or I want them to know about times when, I held myself up and maybe I fell because I wasn't quite ready for whatever that challenge was. I think that courage for me is the biggest thing, and that courage ties into that vulnerability, because it takes courage to be vulnerable.
You use vulnerability often in our conversations. Now, I just kept thinking you're channeling Brene Brown there. Kayla, you want to go ahead and talk about yours?
Yeah, I love this question because it's an example of diversity of thought here. I bet we're all going to have different answers. The one that I think really jumps out to me is collaboration for an inclusive leader. When you are in a leadership position, I think it's easy to just talk and make decisions with other leaders. And that's not being inclusive of the workforce that you have reporting into you as a leader, and the people who are on the front lines, who are the subject matter experts doing the work in and out every day and have a lot of great ideas to contribute. I'll share a quick story. My husband, as I mentioned, also works at Tech Data, and he'll tell you that one of the best leaders he ever had in his whole career path was a leader who was a vice president, but didn't act that way in how he interacted with his team. He acted like just another person on the team. The titles didn't matter. When a big decision was coming, he would go to the team and say, what's your insight? I want your input. What do you think we should do? And get that feedback from all the team members. And even if he chose a final decision that didn't match what the team members suggested, that team still felt okay with that, because they know that their input was factored into that final choice. They were included. They just felt included. And that can make a huge, huge difference in the way you lead. I would say that you're right, seventh C that I would add is credit, because I think recognition is a major thing for inclusive leaders. When you are seeing what your team members are doing and you're recognizing it and you're giving them credit where credit is due, that just shows people, I value what you are contributing here and you are an important part of this team.
I think that's great. Pedro.
Yeah, so for me, I look at this model, I've used it before. I always anchor on cultural intelligence. Because for me, seeking to understand the various cultures that exist within an ecosystem or an enterprise is very important. Not only is the culture that I bring to the environment based on my backgrounds and experience, but there's also team culture, there's organizational culture, there's cultures in societies and things like that. So, I always say my goal is to develop cultural dexterity so that I understand how all these different pieces come into play and how I may need to pivot as I seek to understand. I like to use this model and I connect it. I say by developing cultural intelligence allows me to build a curiosity and the courage to ask and seek to understand different cultures and develop questions. It also allows me to be cognizant of what I don't know, right? And through that cognizance, it hopefully allows me to be able to collaborate across the board. And as I think about what I'm doing here or what we're doing here, Remy James, is D&I has been embedded within our organizational culture. It's one of the things that I appreciate about the firm. It's one of the things that drew me here, because it's like, wait a minute, this is already has been here since the founders that ever uttered the word Raymond James, right? So it's really about sussing those out. So then how do we build a curiosity to seek to understand how all these cultures interplay together? How do we develop the courage to ask questions, whether, well, what does a pronoun mean? What is the distinction between gender identity and gender and sexual orientation or different faiths? Seeking to understand. I have leaders that come to me and say, hey, help me understand how to engage in this conversation with this particular group. It allows for collaboration across the board. So all of our business resource groups, they come together. It's not only our associate business resource group, but I partner with a colleague of mine, Renee Baker, on the advisor side. So we, together, there's that collaboration. So not only are we focused on driving change in the workplace, in the workforce, and in the community, right? Which then drives that commitment that everyone has across the organization. So to me, I wouldn't add anything to it. Actually, if there's anything that I would add is grace, right? Because one of the things we need to understand as practitioners is we need to allow ourselves the grace, because even myself, being in this space for 30 years, there are things that I just don't know. And there are things that I need to seek to understand. So we have to allow us that space to say, you know what? I don't know, and I have to be okay with that. Because if I'm going to lead others and bring them along with me, again, getting back to the psychological safety, I have to be able to be vulnerable to that. So for me, everything's anchored on culture, and they're all interconnected to each other.
Awesome. I love how you're drawing and not in order. So maybe we need to reframe the circle. Okay, so we have 4 more questions to get through before we get into the Q&A. So we're going to go ahead and just jump into talking about studies that show that it's likely to be unsuccessful with D&I training if you don't ask the fundamental question, what is in it for me? So how do you answer this and provide effective training to your associates? And how would you like to see D&I training adapt to promote sustainable, inclusive behaviors? And Kaylee, I would like to start with you since you brought up this ADKAR model.
Yeah, so one of the things I've trained on at Tech Data is this model, and this is a change management model. It's not specific to training or to D&I. This is the ProSci method for change management. But you'll see what they stand for here: awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And that second level, that desire, is where we call it the WIFM, W-I-F-M, what's in it for me? That's this entire piece of desire. You have to make people want to go through a change or want to do something. And we do that through that we need motivation as humans, intrinsic or extrinsic. We need somebody to motivate us to do something, give us a reason to care about it. So when you go through a training, I will say, even though I create these trainings, I am very guilty of doing it. How many of us have had those organizational mandatory trainings on things like code of conduct or just our ethics policies? And we have to go through them because it is important to know these things. Well, but they're so boring. We all know that. They are dry. They're not exciting. It's not new information year after year. We just do it because we have to. And so we are all guilty, I'm sure, myself included, of just letting that play in the background while we do other things because we aren't invested in that information. And so D&I training is no different. If I want somebody to get something out of it, I need to give them a reason to care. Why should they care about it? What matters in this course to them? And even more so than the training, the way we communicate that training ahead of time is so critical for this piece of awareness and desire. I want to walk in feeling like I already know what I'm going to get out of this training. I already have a reason to be excited to be here because the communication ahead of time gave me that information about why this is so critical to me. So many of us here are facilitators and educators. And if you're in that role, think about when you go to advertise a training that you're doing, how are you communicating the purpose of this to people, to give them that piece of information, that what's in it for me, straight out the gate, so that they come into that training with an open mind and they are already ready to learn what you have to teach them.
I think that's valuable information. Melinda, do you have anything to add to that?
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, sorry, we went out of bed.
What'd she say? Can you hear us, Melinda?
Oh, I think we lost Melinda.
Oh, okay. Pedro, would you have something to add?
Yeah, so the one thing I would add to this is my approach has always been, yes, there are those fundamental training courses that we would deliver standalone, but I am of the belief that we need to weave this into the talent life cycle. So part of the way that I look at this and what's in it for me is really getting back to, I always look at is what are the business outcomes that we want to achieve? And then when it comes down to our human capital and developing our people, it's like, what are the behaviors that we want them to demonstrate that allows individuals to feel included and create that sense of belonging? So when we're looking at the talent life cycle, is how do we embed this so that it doesn't feel like people are getting a separate training on D&I, but that it's already baked into the processes, tools, and technology that everyone's using. So if someone's coming in and receiving onboarding, yes, we can talk about D&I initiatives and D&I behaviors and so forth, but we're talking about it as part of a holistic system. So they're not wondering, well, why is this important? So, and as they progress through their careers, and we're doing new manager training, we're having conversations around crucial conversations. Well, let's bring in these, again, going back to the previous conversation around culture. Well, let's help develop the culture dexterity. Let's bring organizational culture, individual culture, and how do you look at that and incorporate that into this principle of managing your people? So for me, as I work with our learning and development organization, is how do we weave this into existing content so that it doesn't feel like it's a separate piece of work, knowing that, yes, we must have conversations around bias, but let's weave that into components around managing teams and so forth. Yes, there's bias when we're looking at recruitment. Well, let's weave that into our talent acquisition processes. And so for me, it's just more that's what's in it for me. The answer is it's to help drive the business to achieve a goal, and all those things that we talk about, why this is important. At the end of the day, is to make you as an individual successful and as a people leader to create this environment of belongingness.
That's great. That just leads us right into our next discussion on organizational culture, because it does affect the way people think and behave. One of the primary roles of the L&D team is to manage the development of people within an organization's culture. What opportunities do each of you see for collaboration between the D&I and L&D to advance cultural competence within the organization? Design inclusive behaviors and skills consistently.
So, Sarah, I'll just piggyback on my previous response is it's very important, and it's making sure that those messages. First of all, we have to understand what are the inclusive behaviors that we need to make sure that everyone is modeling, and then how do we incorporate that into existing content, and then be able to provide opportunities where individuals can practice it. I always say if you introduce a piece of content, you got to let it marinate for a little bit so that it allows so people can absorb it and then be able to understand how to put it into practice. Now, I'd rather have 4 good solid pieces of training in any given year versus 1 training every month, because throughout that period of time, you allow people to understand it, you let them practice it. As Kylie mentioned early on before, this work that we all do is about self-exploration, and everyone's journey is going to be very different. So partnering up with the L&D organization is very important to understand let's look at these inclusive behaviors. How do we sit them on top, or how do we put them alongside with the leadership behaviors that we want the organization to model, which then drives all the other different processes that we talk from a professional development standpoint.
Fantastic. I love it. We have a big L&D team at Raymond James, and I hope to see that collaboration more often, especially with the education around pronouns and all of these things that the networks want to get out there to leadership and to all the associates. Robbie or Kaylee?
So one of the things that we do is we do have some presentations. Obviously, it's a really basic instruction that we give our new hire employees to really learn about our different diversity business groups. But personally, what I do in my classes is I actually encourage my new students to absolutely join the ones that resonate with you. Join the ones that you have a vested interest in. But what I also want them to do is to find a diversity business group that is something completely on the opposite end of your spectrum. So for me, joining our African American diversity business group, I am obviously the whitest person in the room, but it's important for me to learn about the experiences of other people. So I encourage them to not just focus on the ones that are easy for you, but broaden your horizons and join those other groups as an allyship, but also as a way to learn about other people's experiences. Because what I've found is the more you learn about other people, the more you realize that we have a lot more in common than we realize. So this is a great way to kind of broaden your horizons.
Yeah, so at Tech Data, our L&D, we don't really have a defined learning and development team. We have one that's kind of in its infancy right now within our HR department, that within the last year has been growing and kind of shaping into whatever they would like it to become. New leadership, new team members, and they've been delivering a lot of great things, new learning platforms, a lot of new tools, but it's still very new. Up until then, all of the teams that had training or had learning were kind of siloed within the department. So for me personally, I'm an IT trainer. I don't work with our other departments to train them necessarily. So I think there's a great opportunity, because this L&D team is so new to the organization. There's a great opportunity to shape that in partnership with D&I, the D&I team. And one of those examples that they are doing is that we are currently, our learning and development team is launching a new management training for all global management on this concept of servant leadership, what that looks like and how that's an expectation for our leaders moving forward to adopt those practices. And they have built in a D&I module as part of that week-long training. I've been given the very fortunate opportunity to help train that module. I'm very excited, but it just goes to show that there is that partnership and that we do value inclusion if we're already setting the expectation for our leadership that this is something that you should incorporate into how you operate every day.
That's great. I absolutely agree. Education and collaboration, part of most of the company's core values. So we did lose Melinda. She is blaming it on the rain, but if she can come back, we'll have her come back. So we'll move on to our next topic. And because we only have 2 questions left, we'll try to run through these next 2 slides. But age diversity is something I wanted to bring up. This slide shows the many generations that we now have in the workforce, and we all need to learn how to work together to these new ideals and core values. So, for time's sake, I would just like Robbie to answer this one.
Sure. So one of the things that I have found in my job is that we've got a lot of people coming back to the workforce, kind of reinventing themselves, starting a new career at a later chapter in their life. And what I typically allow my students to do is to pick their own seats in the beginning of their class. And what I found is that people congregate towards their similarities, right? So you've got little cliques that always happen. What I do, though, is usually about week 2, I start forcing changes. And what I like to do is I like to take some of our older generation who have some great knowledge, great experiences, background stories, and mix them with the complete opposite end of that age spectrum, because they typically are not going to interact unless you force them. And even though I'm saying force them, it ends up being a good thing, because what I've found is that they're able to work off of each other. So you've got our older generation who's got this great wealth of knowledge and experiences, our younger generation who may be more technologically inclined, who may have a different skill set. And when you put them together, they start feeding off of each other, and it ends up actually making for a much more robust and beneficial group, I found.
Yeah, I think it's very important. Sometimes I feel like it's almost name calling, like, oh, you millennials, as you can see in the chat. But in all seriousness, these are microaggressions, and I feel like having upfront conversations with people about how that may be offensive, and just educate that, let's learn each other's core values and then learn how to work together and collaborate. Okay, so our very last question is about the community, and community is very important to organizations and to everybody, especially in the times that we're in right now. So last question is, in what ways do community partnerships deepen the understanding of diversity and inclusion and contribute to the success of the organization? Kaylee, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think this is a great topic, and one that I'm going to try and contain my answer, because I think I could babble about this topic for a long time. One of the things that I really love about community engagement is that it ties so closely to the purpose of inclusion. I didn't volunteer a lot in my community until I started working at Tech Data, and then I found just opportunity after opportunity to volunteer through the BRGs that we have. And I try and go to everything I can possibly go to, because it really is such an amazing experience. And I think the irony of it is that when you go and you volunteer in your community, you almost wipe out this acknowledgement of differences, which kind of goes against the idea of diversity and inclusion, where we want to highlight those differences and see how they bring us together and they make us all great. But when you're in that volunteer situation, you are there to serve a purpose, and that is just to help another human being who needs your help. And it doesn't matter who they are or what they're like or what their background is or their story or your story. You're just there to help somebody because you are able to help them and they need some help. And I can think one example that jumps out in my mind. I will take the blame here and say that there have been plenty of times when I've been out at the mall or the grocery store prior to current times, and there's maybe a young single mother who's got a crying child, and I think to myself, like, oh my gosh, she can't get a hold of her kid. That's a snap judgment. That's an unconscious bias that I have to address on my own, and I recognize that. But I've had the opportunity once to volunteer at a local women's shelter with Tech Data to cook dinner for the women and their children that were in that shelter fleeing domestic abuse. And just to come in and cook them dinner and talk to these women whose children were also crying and screaming, but I did not care because I just felt like I can't believe the journey that you're on and the battle that you're in. And how is this only, all I'm doing is cooking you dinner. That's not enough for me to do for you. I want to do more because you're just amazing and you're looking out for your kids. And this is so hard and I can't even imagine your struggle. So just being in that place is really humbling, and it makes you realize just how much we relate to one another on a humanitarian basis, and differences don't really matter anymore.
Hi all, it's Melinda again. I had some technical difficulties there, so you may see my screen has me pause in a very embarrassing picture, but as long as you can hear me, and I'm assuming we're on community partnerships and corporate social responsibility. Is that correct,
Yeah,
Cassandra?
that's correct.
Perfect. Okay, so I think I might have mentioned this a little earlier, and I'll say it again. You know, it definitely deepens the understanding of what D&I is initially. So an organic connection with the community can only happen if you insert yourself towards those community initiatives and what's important to the community itself. You know, finding out what's important to them, what are the things that they care about, and who are their leaders. So community partnerships are extremely imperative. You know, by attending conferences, workshops, networking events, and just talking to community leaders themselves, I know personally our museum feels empowered to connect with and advocate for the community, and specifically through our art. We're a Native American and frontier art gallery. So understanding cultures and being organic about understanding those cultures and establishing those relationships and partnerships are very important. Now, in regards to how it can relate to CSR, you know, both are about reaching out to disenfranchised communities, and bringing new ideas and collaboration to the table. So when those are both paired together, you can envision a business community where ideas are being met, economically things are increasing, and there's more social inclusion involved.
I love that. And you had mentioned in our conversation about working with autism and just understanding where they're coming from to make sure you're offering the best programs. You want to talk about that real quick?
Right. So similar to what Pedro mentioned at the very beginning, you know, a part of D&I is, of course, what you physically can't see. And we inherit that when it comes to our community partnerships as well. So we've partnered with CARD, which is here. And essentially what we don't want to be in our partnerships is attend one signature event or one event per year and then say, you know, okay, see you later. We want these relationships to be continuous and organic. So, you know, with that, we want to learn about how to be more autistically friendly and how to make our business autistically friendly for those who have autism. We want to attend their events. We want to go through those trainings. And then reciprocated, we want them to understand what it is to work at the museum and the type of art that we showcase. So, you know, of course, those continuous partnerships are important.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful perspective. Now, up on our slideshow, we just wanted to point out that these are the top coronavirus relief charities during this pandemic. We encourage anybody, if you have the means and opportunities, you know, give back to our community. We will be remembered not by how this virus affected all of us, but what we did to make sure we took care of each other. So on this next slide, we're going to close out before Q&A. We just wanted to share, we had asked the panelists to share with us some of their favorite reads or movies. These are resources. So go ahead and take a snapshot of that, and we'll move on to Q&A.
Michelle, we can't hear you.
It's the rain.
It's Microsoft Teams.
Does that work? Can you
Yeah.
hear me now? Okay, perfect. I was telling Melanie earlier, I was switching between Zoom and Teams every day, and every time it's not right. So I haven't switched to Teams since the last time I talked to you guys, so I'm not sure what happened there, but it's okay. So I just want to thank everybody for such great conversation in the chat. And I did take note of a couple questions. It looked like you guys were sort of answering each other's questions as we went along, but I wanted to, there was two questions that came up in the chat that I didn't see answers come to. And if there are more, I'm sorry. But the first one is, what are panelists? What are your thoughts on the use of they/them for gender neutrality, yet balancing grammar standards which they don't fit into currently?
I would love to answer this because
Okay.
I was an English teacher, so I am a stickler about grammar. But when it comes to somebody's chosen identity, grammar is less important. It just is. So I can't imagine myself in a situation where someone is repeatedly calling me he, his, him. I would be so frustrated if I had to keep telling people that is not who I am. You are calling me the wrong thing. I'd be so frustrated. Even thinking about it, I'm like, man. So when somebody tells you that these are their chosen pronouns because that's who they are, they're not making that up just to be tricky about your grammar. They're not trying to cause an English issue. They're telling you who they are. It's their identity. So it might be uncomfortable. And I'll be the first to admit that when I met somebody recently in my CDP training who went by they, I misgendered them. I called them she in a sentence. And I thought back to a training I went to a while ago through a tech data about being a good ally. And it said, if you misgender a transgender person, apologize, correct it, move on. Because if you harp on it longer, that puts the blame back on that person for saying, look at what you made me do. Like, you've made this so difficult for me to remember your pronouns, and it's not their fault. It's, I made a mistake, correct it, move on. So
that's a great point.
Even if you mess it up and you call someone the wrong thing, fix it, value who they are, and don't let grammar get in the way of that, because that's a human being and they're important.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to chime in on that?
No, I would just add, as I'm sure most little gay children know, when you're talking about somebody that you're interested in or may have gone out on a date with, and you're talking to your conservative grandparents or somebody who doesn't know your truth, and you're talking about how you have a crush on them or they are going out with you, it's actually, even though it feels grammatically incorrect, it is actually not grammatically incorrect to talk about somebody as they or them. That goes back to Shakespearean times where that type of pronoun usage. So this is not an unusual or a new thing. It may just be more that we're more cognizant of it now because it has a different meaning, but it actually is grammatically correct, and it's got a long tradition of being grammatically correct.
I saw that in the chat, actually, that it goes back to a more English, less of an American English. Thank you guys for that. The next question that I saw come up in the chat before we take questions from the audience was, how do you help the team members or people who do not want to be the spokesperson for their diversity group? I don't mind, but I find that there are a lot of people who still feel like they do not want to be the spokesperson for their diversity group and only want to be accepted or included. Any takers?
You hire a community engagement person to.
Do you know anyone, Melinda?
That would be the voice of it. That, again, and I think I spoke about this a little bit, about wanting to not feel afraid to ask those important questions and going back to psychologically safe environment, but through trainings, and I speak with my leadership to get a better understanding as to what is important to us and the type of relationships that we want to foster, and of course what aligns with our own missions and values. So what I aspire and what I hope for is to encourage real friendships and community inclusion with our partnerships, to make those conversations easier, right? So when we aspire to have true conversations with our partner organizations, we again, we don't facilitate a once a year type of interaction. It's something that we are continuously communicating with them with and understanding what's important to them. So just that continuous and organic relationship, and not being afraid to ask those important questions, and not being afraid to ask questions that are sensitive.
I love hearing that about psychological safety, because anybody would recognize that physical safety has to be an integrated part of your culture. It can't just be something you talk about in January and hope it lasts the whole year. So I love to hear that discussion of psychological safety becoming integrated into culture versus just something we do, to Melinda's point, as like a once a year conference and like, did it. So I love it. And I saw that in the chat that we're sort of getting away from that box checking type of inclusion and getting toward a new, real type of inclusion that isn't just on paper for various awards. Okay, those were the only two questions that I thought we missed and didn't catch necessarily in the chat. So at this time, I'd like to open the floor. Unmute yourself, not like me, but unmute yourself. And then if you have a question for one or all of the panelists or either of our moderators, please feel free. Sorry, I have a visitor. Does anybody have any questions? Or if you're more comfortable, feel free to type it into the chat.
Hi, I have a question. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, hi, Chris.
Hey, hi, everyone. Panelists, thank you so much. I really, really, really enjoyed this particular topic and conversation that is become more and more important as time goes on. I did have a question regarding intersectionality in terms of having intersectional identities such as being Black and female or being Asian and LGBTQ. What type of conversations or efforts are being made to acknowledge that those intersections exist amongst the employees in your organizations?
I'll take that one. So one of our initiatives within the past year at USAA is actually to do more cross-collaboration events with our diversity business groups. So if we have, say, during Black History Month, we don't just want our African American diversity business group to spearhead that. We want someone else to come in from a different group and join forces. Same thing with like Pride Month. We don't want it just to be an LGBT focused event. We want another group to come in and really want to pool our resources and pool our participants, because like I mentioned, when you encourage your people to join diversity business groups that are not part of who they are, it encourages you to learn more about them. So what we found is if we can pool our resources and collaborate together, it actually makes the events more impactful. And I've found that people take more away from what they learned and experienced by kind of joining those forces like that.
Yeah, and if I can piggyback on that, it's interesting that Robbie said that example, because the first thing that came to my mind was we like to do a lot of combined events from our business resource groups. We try to do them, and those are really powerful, I think, when the business resource groups come together, because then it's not speaking to only one dimension of identity. One of the most, maybe the most impactful one that I went to was a combination event between our LGBT group Spectrum and our veterans group, TD Patriots. And they held an event and they showed a segment of the documentary Transmilitary. And then they had a speaker come in who is a transgender man who was discharged from the military during the time of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I don't think that there was a dry eye in the room during that presentation, because the stories that came out of it were unbelievable. And it's just not something you think, especially coming from a military perspective, there's a lot of silence. A lot of times as people just don't want to talk about military experience, and there's this need to be tough and quiet and just held together. And there was just a big wall that came down in that presentation, and there were people in that room that were really sharing, and hearing the story of the individual who came to speak to us was just incredible. And the power of that presentation was phenomenal. And so anybody in that room who was military or LGBTQ or both or none at all got so much out of it, because it was just, you were hearing such an amazing story.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. We have a couple questions coming through on the chat. So this one is from Stephanie Kelly. What are some examples of leading from the top in your different organizations? What are the D&I related questions, concerns, actions from your CEOs and CFOs, etc.? And are they walking the walk after initiatives are put in place? Does it take an extra nudge from you? Do you see the light bulb going off during your conversations with them? Great question, because I think we can easily convince CEOs and CFOs of the importance of this. All the C-levels like, yes, we should do that. It's important. But then can they take it on and can they walk the walk? So what are you guys seeing, panelists, in your organizations?
So I'll start because I feel that I have an incredible leadership team at Raymond James. Not only do they talk about it, but they model it. And the types of questions that I've received is, again, as I mentioned earlier, is to seek to understand how do I, and then kind of fill in the blank. One of the things that I would share in this conversation is that I've seen a fundamental shift in how our leaders talk about this. The way that they share their stories has begun to shift the more they start doing their own work. And that own work is to seek to understand how their backgrounds and experiences shape the lens that they see the world and how they make decisions. So the stories that when I first came into the organization that they were sharing around D&I, yes, they were anchored around it's the right thing to do. But now, as I hear them engaging with our associates and participating in panel discussions, the stories are much more personal. The stories are ones of where they have their own aha moments, right? And part of it is as practitioners, we have to help our leaders feel comfortable. We have to create that psychological safety for them as well, because if you think about it, is they're in a position that whatever they say, becomes the law, if you will. So there may be that level of hesitation. So for me, the types of questions that I get is, how do I, or I want to get more involved? Where are the opportunities that we have to seek to understand? And really, it's more the request that I get is, where are there opportunities for me to engage more with different groups and audiences? So again, in summary, is they seek to understand, but they're modeling it not only in the words that they say, but in their actions and by having visible leadership.
Thank you, Pedro. Other panelists, do you want to jump in? What are you seeing at your organizations?
Yeah, I like this question. One of the topics that we're covering in this D&I training that we're about to launch for our management is this model of what are the kind of the levels of what does D&I look like as a leader? Kind of where are you on this grid? And one of the categories, the term that they've coined here is a surface level ally. Are you being a surface level ally in how you lead with inclusion? And what that means is really you look good on paper, but you're not, as the question posed, walking the walk. You send emails and you say, you all should go to this great event, but then you don't come to the event. You say to your D&I team, oh, I know all of my classmates are going to, all my team members are really loving your classes, but you aren't going to the classes. So it's other people making you look good and not because you're really showing up. And that people see that. People can see right through that. Your team members, your employees can see that. And when you really show up and you are a true inclusive leader, then it becomes important to the people that work for you and with you as well. If they see it matters to you, it becomes something that matters to them. So what I really like about my particular leadership team, I think there are leaders in my organization who are at all different levels of inclusive leadership. But for me personally, the SVP that I report into is a phenomenally inclusive leader. she's actually one of the presenters that's going to help train this training because she really believes in it and she walks the walk. She's our executive sponsor for our women's BRG. The CIO that I report into is our executive sponsor for our LGBTQ BRG. They're both really heavily involved. And our CEO makes inclusivity part of everything he does. In his messages that he sends out, there's always a tone of inclusivity, and it's something important to him. And he makes the time, even though he's CEO of a 15,000 person global company, to come to events like the Pride flag raising at the beginning of June, or we raised this year the Pan-African flag for Black History Month for the first time ever, and he was there. And that makes a difference when you see people show up for even these small events and know that this is something that's important to them, so it should be important to the rest of us.
Amen. I love that. Okay, we have another question from the chat. It has been my experience that, this is from Suzanne. It has been my experience that disability is the last taboo in diversity and inclusion. Those of us with disabilities are afraid to speak up freely because employers can decide another candidate who was the second choice gets picked instead if we freely disclose our disabilities. I have a lot of thoughts on the topic, and I'm currently working on certification for delivering 508 compliant training content, but I feel like it doesn't have a full seat at the table. What can you guys tell us about that?
So I can share with you, at USAA, we have a wonderful diversity business group called Dunamis, and it is specifically tied around disabilities, whether invisible or seen. And as a company, we recognize that that disability is a huge part of being a human, right? We all have things that happen to us, and specifically we serve the military at USAA, so we know that our membership is comprised of people who have a range of disabilities, and because of that, we need to adapt to what they need. We spend resources and money making sure that everything that we have as far as communication and technology, literature, even as far as coming out with credit cards that have raised numbers on them so that they can be read easier by people with visual disabilities. So I think that that moving forward, it's going to be in the best interest of companies to recognize that you have to be accepting of people's disabilities. We have an aging population in our country, and with aging comes the breakdown of our bodies, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. It just is what it is. So I think that the better companies out there are going to recognize this and are going to stop shying away from the fact that that we have fallible human bodies. We're not robots yet, so until we are, we're all going to have disabilities at some point in our life.
Yet, not robots yet.
Not yet. It's coming soon enough.
And I think to just kind of echo what Kaylee had said earlier is the mental health or mental disability is in that group too that Suzanne was talking to us about. And I think I'm just glad to see this movement and hear this panel, and I'm sort of honored to be here. So before I move on to some final announcements, I'd like to just do a quick kind of round robin of the panelists. If you could tell membership, tell us one last thing, what do you want us to leave tonight's session with? I'm going to start with Pedro because he's next to my picture on my screen, maybe not yours.
Wow. So what I want to leave you all with is that diversity inclusion, it's a journey. It's about self-exploration. And in the times that we are today, I just also want us to be cognizant of how we're interacting in this new environment, right? There's a lot of emphasis on focus, on inclusion. Let's make sure that we take the time to reach out to those that we were connecting with before, but now may not be part of our normal circles now because the world is requiring us to interact in a very different way. Several months ago, I was leading events where we were bringing everyone together. Now we're asking individuals to stay 6 feet apart or connect virtually. So let's show some empathy. Let's think about all these topics that we discussed today, and figure out a way to connect with someone that we typically wouldn't connect with in this new environment, and just to extend a courtesy call, say, hey, how you doing, right? Because empathy is just about being able to go down to where they are and just acknowledging. I believe that there are individuals right now that just are looking for someone to listen. So thank you all for giving me the opportunity and the platform to share my perspectives and points of view. And I look forward to engaging you all again sometime in the near future. Be safe.
Thank you, Pedro. You too. Kaylee?
Yeah, I think what I hope you take away from this is that there is something you can do in whatever organization you're in, whatever level of D&I awareness you have. You might not have anything going on at your organization. That's a reality for people. And we're not asking you to go out and set up 5 BRGs overnight and start driving a whole D&I program, because that's not realistic. But there is something you can do. You can encourage your team members to come do a volunteer activity with you outside of work. If it's, even looking for something right now, can we make a donation to one of those organizations on the screen from a few slides ago, because we can't go physically volunteer right now while we're separated, but we can do something to help. And just to show that being inclusive and looking out for other people is important. In my role right now, I'm still an IT trainer. My role is not D&I. And since I got my certification in December, I've been trying to do some little D&I efforts on the side to be more of a champion within my own department. And one of those things is that I'm just sending out reminder emails when there's BRG events coming up, and just saying, hey, if you didn't see this email because you weren't on the BRG distribution list, just so you know, this is open to everybody. Come walk in the MLK Day parade with us. We did in January. Come to this event that we hosted on how to support your team members who are dealing with mental health problems, because that was a great presentation. And I had a team member come up to me a few weeks ago and just say, hey, strange question, but you've been sending out these emails lately as these reminders. And I said, yeah. And he goes, why do you care? And it was like a really just an eye-opening question to me. And he said, it's just that nobody has ever done that before. And I said, well, that doesn't mean that it's the way we have to do things. Just because nobody's done it before doesn't mean that's the right way to do it. Why shouldn't there be somebody reminding us that we can go to these? And I saw this colleague on that mental health presentation because I had sent out that email, and he didn't know it was something he could do until my reminder came out. So if I can do something as small as send an email and get people to come to something they didn't know was available, that's a really small step that you can do as well, just to help spread the word and get something started, get the ball rolling. So look for those opportunities where you can be a D&I advocate in your organization and help grow that as a grassroots kind of effort.
Thank you. Robbie?
So my big takeaway is really to not be afraid to be vulnerable and not be afraid to be authentic in your interactions with people. We tend, I think, as leaders to surround ourselves with people that share a lot of our commonalities. But I promise you that if you are authentic in your interactions with people, there is going to be at least one person out there who is going to be touched and moved in a way that they don't share with you until maybe 20 years later, when you get that message from somebody telling you how you impacted their life. And it really all comes down to just being yourself and not being afraid to live your truth.
Thank you, Robbie. And Melinda?
I'd say to not be afraid to ask questions, and more importantly, celebrate differences. One way that you can show that you want to learn or respect backgrounds and traditions is to invite people to share their ideas and to share those traditions in the workplace. When we show that we are encouraging people to express their backgrounds and talk about traditions, it's showing an organic knowledge and wanting to understand. So I would definitely say not be afraid to ask questions and to celebrate differences, for sure.
Thank you. And then Cassandra or Melanie, is there anything you want to add before we move to announcements?
Yeah, I think everything was very well said in a conclusion, but I would just like people to know that you have more allies around you than you probably know. So, to piggyback off of Melinda, talk about it, talk about your issues. You have leadership around you who care and who want to make a difference, but if you don't bring these concerns to them, there's no way for them to know and be able to address it. So, speak your voice, speak your truth, and be vulnerable.
Great. That's a great message. So thank you guys so much. This has been an amazing panel. We had so many people be able to call in and get educated on this super important topic. And we couldn't be more thankful to our panelists and to our membership for taking this subject very seriously. To Melanie and Cassandra, who put it all together for us. We're just so happy to have brought this event to you guys tonight virtually. And many of you heard, if you're part of the ATD sphere, that unfortunately our big conference of the year, ICE, has been canceled. But don't worry, because ATD Suncoast has got you covered with tons of great programming coming up, and even some opportunities for just a virtual happy hour. So next week on the 22nd, we have a virtual happy hour. Wednesday, the 29th, we have Brainstorm and Brew. And so the Learning on Tap crew and the Consultancy SIG have gotten together, and they're going to be talking about real world design and using collaborative tools. Then early into May, the Consultancy SIG is going to talk about work challenges. This is such a great group. Bring your challenge, and basically you just get a group of highly qualified professionals to bounce your ideas off of. If you've got a work challenge happening, bring it to the Consultancy SIG. The Sarasota gig is going to be taking a look at the new ATD capability model. If you haven't heard, CPLP is out and CPTD is in, and Lori Ann Roth is going to be there. On the 14th of May, we're very excited to be bringing in a mental health panel. So how is mental health affected by COVID? It's a special edition COVID experience, and so we're very excited about that. Higher Ed Gig is going to be talking to Alex Salas about better e-learning with chatbots. And then, of course, closing out May just before the holiday weekend. Maybe we'll be at the beach, maybe not. We have our last Learning on Tap of May, which is just a time to get together and talk about learning stuff. Usually at a brewery, but typically online at this point. So if you can make it to any of our events, we'd love to have you there. We're really enjoying doing them virtually. We're so excited that I think even more people are able to make it. So thank you for coming tonight. If you're not a member of our chapter, please consider joining. We really enjoy having you around with us. And be well out there. Be safe. So.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.